One worry or concern that I see come up pretty frequently and repeatedly with students, with clients, with ordinary people who are interested in philosophy, and even more broadly in literature, we could say, is this concern with getting names right. And by this, I don't mean a perfectionism of getting every single name perfectly right. I mean a worry that you're getting important people's names wrong. You're mispronouncing them, and that as a result, because, these people are usually long dead, so it's not as if they're going to suffer from it, other people are going to look at the person mispronouncing a name and think less of them. So, what would be examples of this? And it doesn't always necessarily have to be a name. It could also be a technical term. So, how do you pronounce Friedrich Nietzsche, for example? Or Martin Heidegger, these are German names. Or Jean-Paul Sartre, right? Do you say Sartre? How do you pronounce Albert Camus, right? People get very, very worked up about this, and there's always somebody out there ready to correct you if they think that their pronunciation is closer to the original. And here's what I'm going to say right off the bat. Don't worry about it. So long as people know who you're referring to, or if it's a technical term like proiresis, for example, in Aristotle or Epictetus or Plutarch or whoever, so long as people actually know what you're talking about, that's the main thing that matters. If you get a vowel in a name, or you miss up a consonant in somebody's name wrong, right? That's not a big deal, unless people want to make it a big deal. And, we'll think about that motivation in just a moment. But think about cases where we don't worry about that. Do we stress that when it comes to Cicero, the great Roman philosopher and orator, that if we're being technically correct in the Latin of his time, it would be Cicero? No, we don't. Nobody calls him that except for pedants and weirdos, right? Do we say, you cannot say Aristotle, you must say Aristoteles or Plato, Platon, Socrates, Socrates? No, we don't do that. I mean, there are some people out there, and I will mention contemporary Demotic Greek speakers as people who are particularly prone to that, in my experience, to think that, their contemporary pronunciation is how things were pronounced way, way back 2,000 plus years ago. But quite honestly, nobody really talks like that. Now, of course, more contemporary languages. I mentioned Friedrich Nietzsche. He's a 19th century thinker. If you say Nietzsche or Nietzsche, it's really not that big of a deal. You may worry that you're signifying to people that you don't really understand or know the thinker, but I mean, the proof of that is in the proverbial pudding. If you're going to give a lecture about Friedrich Nietzsche, but you actually give a good lecture, or you ask a question that's on point that shows that you've actually read a text that you're referencing, like The Birth of Tragedy or Thus Spoke Zarathustra, well, that should, for any reasonable interlocutor, shine through. I will point out that there are many important, famous thinkers out there, and you can see interviews with them, and the Brits are particularly prone to this, who routinely mispronounce foreign names, like, Immanuel Kant, right? The ah sound. There's plenty of people out there who will call him Kant. And That's okay. Are you going to stop listening as soon as somebody makes what seems to be a mistake like that? I mean, technically it is a mistake. Probably not, because you still want to hear what it is that they have to say. So if you're worried about whether, you're referencing somebody and getting their name wrong, it's really not that big of a deal. I mean, would it be better for you to get everybody's names more or less, say, in the ballpark? You don't even have to be like perfect, but, more or less the same. Sure, that's nice, but, we live in a world in which people pronounce the same thing many different ways depending on what dialects they speak. And I'm just talking about English here. I mean, if we're looking at other languages, there's dialects in those as well, and those change the way we pronounce things. And that's okay. Again, the key is whether you are comprehensible. If you say, I'm looking at Blunkeblunk's works, and then somebody's like, I don't know who the hell Blunkeblunk is. And you're like, oh, you're mispronouncing it. It's Blunkeblunk, Well, if you meant Nietzsche by that, obviously you got a problem, right? Or you meant Immanuel Kant. Well, you need to get closer in pronunciation. Neither of them correspond to Blunkeblunk, right? But if you're saying, Immanuel Kant, or you're saying Frederick Nietzsche, I think people can figure that out. If you're miswriting things sometimes, and you write Hagel for Hegel when it's Hegel, I think people will still know who you're talking about if you're referencing the phenomenology of spirit or the master-slave dialectic or things, the struggle for recognition. People are going to understand what you're saying. So, you may get criticized by some people, but let's think about the motivations of people who want to criticize and correct you on something so trivial as a name being mispronounced. What's going on there? I mean, some people just are pedants, and they just want to show their own, superiority or authority by putting other people down. And do you really need to care about what those kind of people think? They're usually miserable, resentful, sourpusses. And, maybe if they control your destiny, like they're your dissertation advisor, okay, now you've got, to work with them, and you probably need to get along at least while you're working under them. But you don't really need to care about them. There's other people who think that they're helping you out. They're actually good motivated, let's say, but a little bit misguided, thinking that it's up to them to make sure everybody pronounces things correctly. And you could say, well, why do you care so much? I mean, some of them, I suppose, think, well, the ghost of the philosopher won't rest well in their grave or wherever they are unless their names are pronounced correctly every single time when somebody comes around. And that's a crazy thought, isn't it? So, when you think about these motivations, some of them reveal themselves as being a bit weird, a bit off. Some people may think that it's their job to, enforce some sort of, I suppose it's not grammar police, it's like pronunciation police. And maybe some are also thinking that if they don't correct you, you're going to confuse other people. They understand what you're saying, but other people will get confused, and that'll be a problem. But, none of those are motivations that I think really need to have you all that concerned about what these people think. And if it's holding you back, if your worries about, am I getting this name right, are keeping you from asking a question during a lecture or feeling secure enough to talk about a person, I'm willing to say you can set those aside. People are, in general, if they're people of goodwill, they're going to be relatively flexible and forgiving when it comes to how we pronounce things. And I would say that goes just as much for key philosophical terms as it does for people's names. We're doing philosophy right now, for example, thinking about this, speaking English, and a large part of the world uses English as a first or second language. It may not always be like that. For a long time, Latin was, at least in the West, the lingua franca. The other languages, Sanskrit, long after it was no longer in vernacular use, was being used to write treatises in, classical Chinese. We could go on and on and on, right? English may end up like that someday, and the pronunciations that we favor in English may go out of favor, and who knows what people will be talking about or what terms they'll be using and how they'll pronounce them 200, 500, 1,000 years from now. It's good to sometimes place these things, you might say, within a larger context. So, for example, do we need to correct people when they talk about, St. Augustine of Hippo? No, he didn't call himself Augustine. It would be Augustinius, I think, right? But we all know what you're talking about when you bring him up. So, if this helps you out, I'm really happy. If it's something that's not relevant to you because you don't have those worries or you always pronounce things correctly, that's great too. And, you can just skip through this. If you're one of those people who loves to correct other people, you might want to think about, what are you actually after in doing that? And does it have the effect that you want it to have? Or are you just coming across as, somebody who's a nitpicker, somebody who's a pedant, somebody who is raining on other people's parades, if we want to use that expression? And if that's the case, then maybe you want to look at what you get out of it and what other people are not getting out of it, and how it might be standing in the way of doing philosophy together and doing it well and enjoyably.